The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
Liberty. Liberty.
Liberty.
Liberty.
Liberty. Liberty. Liberty.
Liberty.
Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner, cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
It may be Thanksgiving weekend for the rest of us, but nobody around Washington seems to be giving thanks these days. Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. Stacey Abrams is not giving thanks, claiming the governor's seat in Georgia was stolen from her. We'll examine those claims and the ones made by Republicans about shenanigans in Broward County, Florida, and broaden the discussion to the state of the American electoral system when we're joined in just a moment by acclaimed journalist and voting fraud expert, John Fund. We saw another one of those obscure district court judges rule that President Trump can't stop people from entering the country when they're breaking the law. Trump then ruffles feathers by essentially exonerating Saudi Arabia in the gruesome murder of Jamal Khashoggi for the sake of the American economy, and then the stock market takes a nosedive. We'll talk about all of that, plus we'll cue up LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza for Talkin' Liberty. Well, one of the enduring legacies of the 2018 midterm elections, in addition to the Democrats winning back the House, is stinging accusations by both parties of voter fraud and official corruption in at least 3 races, in Florida, of course, and Georgia. And here to sort things out for us is a man familiar to many of you and author of 2 important books on voter fraud, one entitled Stealing Elections, the other Who's Counting? John Fund, who's seen it all over the years and is currently national affairs columnist for National Review Online and a senior editor at the American Spectator. Welcome to Liberty Nation, Mr. Fund.
Thanks, Tim. Happy to be with you.
So appreciate it. So Republicans say Democrats tried to fabricate votes in Florida after the clock ran out on election night. And Democrats say the Republican who won for governor of Georgia commandeered his own victory by engaging in all manner of voter suppression techniques. Which of these is true? One of them? Both? Neither?
Let's look at the big picture first and work down. About 40% of the American people have zero confidence that their vote is going to be counted accurately or fairly. And that's a big problem for our democracy and our republic, because if people are that cynical about things, voter turnout is lower, people have less confidence in the outcome of the election, and view the actions of the government as less legitimate than they otherwise would be. So we all have a stake in improving our election process and improving the perception of it. And in 2002, after the Florida meltdown with Bush v. Gore, Congress passed a law called the Help America Vote Act. And what they said is, we're going to provide money to the states for better voting machines and systems, but the states have an obligation to clean up their voter rolls and act more responsibly and try to preserve election integrity. That was bipartisan. Senator Chris Dodd, the Democratic co-sponsor, said, we're a great country. We can make it both easy to vote and hard to cheat. We can do both. Well, at least under the Obama administration, the easy to vote part was fine. The hard to cheat part, they completely ignored it. What you now have is a situation where both in Florida and Georgia, you had election officials who were so incompetent, so disorganized, that you can't tell where the incompetence left off and where the fraud or conceivably voter suppression began. It's a national problem, not just a Florida and Georgia problem.
Now, I think back to the reality that a few thousand misguided votes for Pat Buchanan in Palm Beach County because of a poorly designed ballot cost Al Gore the presidency in 2000, the famous recount of a lifetime. So I ask you addressed it in your answer, but was what happened in Broward County this year really a case of incompetence or really more fraud?
Well, it was both, probably, although proving fraud is harder than proving the incompetence because the incompetence covers up the fraud. By the way, with regard to Florida in 2000, of course, yes, Pat Buchanan got some votes that should have gone to Al Gore because of a poor ballot placement. At the same time, though, we know about 12 or 1,400 felons who shouldn't have been voting did vote, and I suspect the vast majority of them voted for Al Gore. So you can go back and play what-ifs on almost every level on that race. But what happened in Broward County was two things. Very poor ballot placement for the Senate race, which meant about 32,000 fewer people voted on that line. If they split about the way that they split countywide, the race would have been within a few hundred votes. At the same time, however, after the election, the elected supervisor of election said, well, we're going to let people change their ballot if it was rejected as an absentee because of a mismatched signature. And there's allegations that they allowed people to come in far later than the legal limit, as late as a week after the election, to try to change their ballot, to try to, I suspect, give more votes to Mr. Gillum. This elected Board of Supervisors head, Brenda Snipes, had been sanctioned by judges in the past for failing to meet transparency and open record laws, for reporting election results before the polls closed, for all kinds of problems. Her problems were so great, she resigned this week.
Right.
She just left the office. I mean, she's out the building. And by the way, her predecessor had to be forcibly removed by marshals. That's how she got the job originally. Her predecessor was so incompetent and fraud-stained that she had to do that. So Broward County is a sinkhole of not only competence but fraud. And I suspect the new governor, Republican Ron DeSantis, is going to try to find some election professional who can make sense of it, because for the last 20 years, the county has been an embarrassment, and we don't want them dictating the result of the 2020 presidential election like they did in 2000.
Indeed. And I've heard many other county election supervisors in Florida outraged at this because, of course, the whole state gets smeared by the incompetence or fraud of Broward County. As we continue with John Fund here on Liberty Nation, let's go to the other side here, John. There was outrage on the left about the Georgia gubernatorial race, charges that Secretary of State Brian Kemp put up all kinds of obstacles to minority voters, purging hundreds of thousands of people from the voter rolls, closing a lot of polling places, generating long lines in heavy minority districts. Doesn't, at the very least, the very notion of a Secretary of State at the state level, the person usually responsible for supervising elections, being in charge of his own election raise red flags by itself?
Well, it certainly does in the view of many in the public. But there's a couple things we have to remember. One is the actual supervision of the elections takes place at the county or city level. The Secretary of State in almost every state exercises a ministerial function. They coordinate the county activities. They conduct oversight over the counties, but they don't actually run the elections. They don't actually count the votes. But most people don't know that. They think the Secretary of State runs the election system. So just for perception purposes, I think it would be better to go to a nonpartisan Secretary of State system, so you don't have this problem that you had not only in Georgia but in a couple other states where Secretary of State was running. The counties run the elections, and all of the problems that resulted, for example, in Florida or in Georgia were at the county level. Now, the one thing that the Secretary of State did have responsibility for in Georgia was the list of the maintenance of the statewide list of registered voters. That list hadn't been cleaned up since 2012 or 2011. There were clear problems. 15 to 20% of people, had moved, had died, had left the state. And the list had to be cleaned up, because if you have a bad list, just like with anything, you're going to have potential problems, and people can misrepresent themselves, impersonate someone else. So this was a routine cleansing of the list. And basically what people forgot was, even if you were thrown off the list, even if you were flagged as somebody that had to be asked questions about or show your ID, you could still vote. All you had to do was cast a provisional ballot on Election Day at the polls and then clear up whatever bad information was on your voting roll or voting record. And that took care of the whole problem. So much of what this voter suppression hysteria is about is simply because Brian Kemp set himself up as a target because as the Secretary of State, it looked as if he was in charge of the election. It also looked as if he was taking people off the rolls, but actually it was entirely routine and entirely understandable given his responsibilities.
John, thanks so much for joining us.
A real pleasure, Tim. Again, good luck with your Liberty program.
Thank you. That is John Fund. Quick break, and then we're back with our signature segment, Say What?, featuring a non-concession concession, Trump and the Saudis, and protecting the border from the caravan after a judge rules that Trump can't.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner. This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
Say What, the portion of Liberty Nation Radio where we roll out some of the most wacky, astonishing, and damnable things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. In a busy week in the world of politics, there's something new. We saw another one of those obscure district court judges rule that President Trump cannot stop people from entering the country when they're breaking the law. President Trump ruffled feathers by essentially exonerating Saudi Arabia in the gruesome murder of Jamal Khashoggi for the sake of the American economy. And the stock market took a nosedive. We'll get to all of that, but we'll start with the non-concession concession by defeated Georgia gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams, who we discussed with John Fund earlier in the show. She leveled serious charges of voter suppression against her victorious opponent, Brian Kemp.
Citizens tried to exercise their constitutional rights and were still denied the ability to elect their leaders. Under the watch of the now former Secretary of State, democracy failed Georgia. I acknowledge that former Secretary of State Brian Kemp will be certified as the victor in the 2018 gubernatorial election. But to watch an elected official who claims to represent the people in this state baldly pin his hopes for election on the suppression of the people's democratic right to vote has been truly appalling. So let's be clear. This is not a speech of concession.
And so confidence in the electoral process on the fairness of voting will take another hit amid polls showing that the constant accusations of Russian meddling in 2016 put forward by the Democrats, and, of course, the appointment of a special counsel to investigate it, some 40% of voters actually believe Russia tampered with the actual votes in 2016. And again, some 40% do not have confidence their votes will be counted fairly. But that story was quickly overshadowed by another one of those obscure district court judges looking for his 15 minutes of fame, Judge John S. Tigger, no relation to the character in Winnie the Pooh, I presume, from where else San Francisco issued a nationwide restraining order barring enforcement of the policy President Trump announced on November 8th, limiting asylum seekers to legal checkpoints. So what is Customs and Border Enforcement supposed to do now when the caravan arrives? CBP Director Kevin McAleenan said on Fox News that this heavily male caravan represents a genuine threat.
This is a different kind of caravan. This is a very large group. It's cohesive. It's primarily adult males. We've seen them cross 2 international borders by force already. They've assaulted law enforcement professionals both in Guatemala and Mexico. And so we've seen them being willing to use very aggressive tactics. And so we've got to be prepared for that. So the worst case contingency would be thousands of people trying to force their way through vehicle lanes at a port of entry unlawfully into the U.S. And that's what we're prepared to stop.
Already, the folks in the Mexican border town of Tijuana have made clear that the caravanners are not welcome there. But just as that story got heated up, President Trump raised a ruckus by saying, despite plentiful evidence and reason to believe that the Saudi royal family was involved or even masterminded the murder of dissident Jamal Khashoggi, he's not making any sudden moves against them.
It's America first to me. It's all about America first. We're not going to give up hundreds of billions of dollars in orders and let Russia, China, and everybody else have them. Saudi Arabia, if we broke with them, I think your oil prices would go through the roof. I've kept them down. They're buying hundreds of billions of dollars worth of things from this country. If I say we don't want to take your business, if I say we're going to cut it off, they will get the equipment, military equipment, and other things from Russia and China. I'm not going to destroy the world economy, and I'm not going to destroy the economy for our country by being foolish with Saudi Arabia.
So Trump, once again, is actually saying what every other politician thought but never stated. And he's getting hammered for it by high-minded politicians in both parties that say we have to stand up for American principles, as if our relationship with Saudi Arabia is based on any kind of principle to begin with. We get cheap oil from them, and they're a relatively stable pro-American regime in a region full of corrupt authoritarian regimes, including theirs. Our relationship with Saudi Arabia is and always has been about money, plain and simple, and exists not because of, but in spite of, the ruling House of Saud. Now, just as the Trump-Saudi Arabia story was breaking, the stock market tanked, dropping almost 1,000 points early in the week, largely due to a plunge in tech stocks. The new term is the FANG stocks: Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google. But Trump's chief economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, said, hold the panic.
The economy, the basic economy, has reawakened, and it's going to stay there. I mean, I'm reading some of the weirdest stuff, how recession is around the corner. Nonsense. My personal view, our administration's view, recession is so far in the distance, I can't see it.
We can only hope. We close with another statement demonstrating how the left has moved on from condemning Trump to condemning the 62 million people who voted for him. The latest on CNN from once respectable liberal Kirsten Powers, aimed at white women.
They'll say, well, I'm not racist. I just voted for him because, you know, I didn't like Hillary Clinton. And I just want to say that that doesn't make you not racist. It actually makes you racist.
So the, 25 million or so white women who voted for Trump are not just deplorable and irredeemable, but outright racist. A word that used to actually mean something, but which has now been used so often by the left as to be rendered meaningless. And it says little about Trump and everything about leftists who continue to treat Trump as if he is an illegitimate president tearing the world apart, when in actuality what he's doing is tearing their world apart. Quick break, and then we're back to talk Barack Obama and why the former president seems so different these days, and not in a good way.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
What we have heard here today has been a political spectacle.
We elect these guys to run the country. They're just not doing their job.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Liberty Nation Radio, heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. And when I say coast to coast, I mean everywhere, including Alaska. A special welcome this week to the good folks of Kenai, Alaska, fairly near Anchorage, listening on KSRM 920 AM. Thanks for jumping on board. Remember that famous saying by Michelle Obama in the heart of the 2016 presidential election about Republicans? When they go low, we go high. But after sitting restlessly on the sidelines for the 2 years following his departure from the White House, Barack Obama put the gloves on and came out swinging at his successor during the midterm election campaign, and he now continues apace after the election to go anything but high. In fact, the former president sounds like a different man, bitter, angry, appearing to resent all of Trump's accomplishments, his achieving things Obama never achieved during his 8 years in office. The man of hope and change has descended to fear and loathing, and his comments this week were the most striking of all.
We are still confused, blind, shrouded with hate, anger, racism, mommy issues. We are fraught with stuff.
Mommy issues? Really? Does that sound like the same Obama who used his gift for soaring rhetoric to inspire Democrats and many independents to elect him twice to the most powerful position in the world? And on this business of Trump having mommy issues, perhaps Obama's engaging in projection by projecting his own daddy issues onto Trump. What do I mean by that? Well, Obama's father, Barack Sr., essentially abandoned his family, divorced the young Obama's mother after 3 years, and took off for Africa, where he advanced his Marxist ideology as a government official in Kenya, seeing his son one time for the rest of his life. And if you read Obama's book, Dreams for My Father, as I have, you understand his daddy issue. But now he says Trump has mommy issues. Now, this whole thing all started in the run-up to the 2016 election when Obama derided candidate Trump on numerous occasions for using divisive language aimed at his political opponents. The former president chided Trump for calling Obama the founder of ISIS. He told Trump to stop whining about the election being rigged. And when Trump continued to rail against Clinton, calling her crooked Hillary, Obama complained that the heated rhetoric was divisive. Since Clinton's resounding defeat, however, Obama has perfected the same tactics for which he endlessly scolded Trump. He suggested that the country was a much better place before Trump was sworn into office, as he basked in complimenting himself, perhaps aware that he can't attack Trump on the booming economy, the roaring markets, millions of new jobs created, and ISIS pretty much defeated. Obama has become obsessed with insulting Trump personally. He accused Trump of blatantly, repeatedly, boldly, shamelessly lying about the migrant caravan marching towards the U.S.-Mexico border. It's quite remarkable to see one U.S. president flat out call another a liar and then have the audacity to lecture others on civility. In September, Obama called his successor radical and a demagogue during a speech in which he referred to himself 79 times in under an hour. He went on to suggest that bigots and fearmongers are attempting to exploit politics, another not-so-subtle dig at the Donald. Before that, Obama said Trump has spent 70 years on this earth showing no regard for working people, unquote, apparently unaware or unwilling to accept that it was working people who elected Trump, many of whom voted for Obama twice and then for Trump. And Obama's now left trying to salvage his place in history. But listen to his comments this week about all the little people he had to deal with on his way up the ladder. And then, well, just listen.
So you start off, you're a community organizer and you're struggling to try to get people to recognize each other's common interests. And, you're trying to get some project done in a small community. And you start thinking, okay, you know what, this alderman's a knucklehead and, you know, they're resistant to doing the right thing. And so you go to the state legislature and you look around and you say, well, these jamokes, I mean, you start getting that sense of, this is just like dealing with the alderman. Then you go to the U.S. Senate and you're looking around and you're like, oh, man. And then when you're president, you're sitting in these international meetings, and it's like the G20, and you got all these world leaders, and it's the same people. Most of what you need to learn, you can actually just read Dr. Seuss.
Dr. Seuss? What's happened to this guy? I mean, as I asked earlier, does this sound like the same Barack Obama? This man can't stand the idea that Trump is anything more than a complete failure, as he and his cohorts predicted he would be. Not to mention a president fulfilling one bold campaign promise after another, mostly against the will of the political establishment, of which Obama is a certified member. Trump has wiped out almost everything Obama put in motion, and all Obama has left is the tattered remnants of Obamacare. One way or the other, the 44th president will have at least another 2 years and perhaps 6 to stew in his own juices and pray that the elite media continues to protect what little is left of his legacy and continues to ignore the roaring economy that even Obama admits but tries to take credit for. Plus record low unemployment, restored consumer and business confidence, and all the other things Trump has accomplished that Obama could not or did not. Quick break, and then we're back with Talkin' Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
We've got it all going on at Liberty Nation on top of this radio show. 5 facts videos which clarify otherwise complicated issues. Our Liberty Nation TV Roundtable, our podcast, The Uprising, all available to you by subscribing to the LibertyNation.com YouTube channel. And now we welcome you into the portion of Liberty Nation Radio which we entitle Talkin' Liberty. It is self-explanatory. And on this Thanksgiving week, we welcome in again our regular contributor, LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, and of course, constitutional lawyer, just to burnish his credentials, Scott Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Tim, not only is all that true, I am sitting within eyesight of Independence Hall right now. So happy Thanksgiving to you and everyone else.
Yes, you've gone there simply to be in a patriotic spot for Thanksgiving. I know you have no other connection to Philadelphia. Let's talk about Title IX and the ACLU and their apparent abandonment of the principle of due process on college campuses. Tell us the sad story of what Betsy DeVos, Education Secretary, did and how the nation's oldest civil rights protector reacted to it.
The Obama administration announced on the day that Barack Obama announced his re-election campaign that they would strongly encourage, and by encourage, that's sort of with a wink and a nod. It's almost a requirement, but we can get into the specifics on that in a second. Encourage colleges to basically just sort of one of these women don't lie kind of things. So just take a woman's word for it in any kind of sexual harassment or assault allegation. And so what that meant, Tim, was that the due process protections that we would all expect a college might engage in terms of investigating claims that an accusation perhaps were not true or there was another explanation were cast by the wayside in many different ways. And the chief sufferers among that were men who were either unjustly accused or maliciously falsely accused. What happened was Betsy DeVos and the Department of Education said that colleges are now going to be expected to give due process protections to the people who pay them money to go to school there if they're accused of wrongdoing. It's pure and simple that. There are many components to these due process protections, but that's the long and short of it. And sadly, The ACLU then came out and said that there were now too much due process protections.
Too much due process.
Too much due process, which is
sort of like too much money, Scott. Too much money is
like money. And,
too much.
They say you can't have enough money or RAM, Tim, and and due process. We could add another to that. And really, while Tim, the ACLU has in the past, to be sure, not taken up causes that those of us who support the full spectrum of civil liberties would expect they would, namely firearm rights. They don't actively, come out against those things usually. They just say we're not going to take a position. But to actually say and advocate for less due process
yes. I
is,
mean, that
is a real shocking reversal, Tim. And I one Reason magazine writer whose name I wish I could remember now but can't, said they've now segued from a civil rights organization with a lefty bent to a progressive political organization with a civil rights history. And that's a profoundly sad moment in American history, I think, Tim.
Now, you have a lot more confidence and faith in the mission of the American Civil Liberties Union than I do. I mean, let's face it, over the years, they've been a leftist group that picks and chooses their targets, and almost all of them are in support of leftist causes, though occasionally they'll support, for example, the Nazis' right to march on Skokie, Illinois, just so they can say that they're balanced.
Well,
but come on, Scott, I mean,
they're socialists too, Tim. Always remember that.
That's true. They're both
right.
They're both socialists and nationalists.
That's a lie. That's a lie from the left, by the way. To cast them as right wing.
That's right. That's well, that's a whole other conversation. But in any case, you place a lot more stock in the ACLU than I do, to be sure. But let's transition over to election fraud, and not in Georgia and not in Florida, which have gotten all the attention, but actually on Los Angeles's Skid Row. What's this about?
Yeah, there was a number of indictments handed down, charging people with paying these Skid Row, what do you call them, occupants or drifters?
Vagrants. Vagrants is what we used to call them. But you can't anymore.
A couple of cigarettes to basically fraudulently sign absentee ballots and things like that. Now, I think it's an important story because anytime votes are stolen, they're stolen from those people who actually did vote. In other words, the power of the vote, right? And I think that, unfortunately, the mainstream media is very focused on quote unquote voter suppression or intimidation efforts is what we hear about. But we don't hear about these other types of things that happen, I think, very often, Tim, in large cities that have lockstep one party control. Now, they don't use the word Democrat in the story, which I think is how we can tell it's about a Democrat.
Exactly.
If there's a dog catcher in Skokie, Illinois that behaved inappropriately, who's a Republican, they're going to announce Republican behaves inappropriately. But if there's a major city mayor who does something bad and he's a Democrat, we just hear city mayor does something bad.
Or sometimes they'll say who claims to be a Democrat, so that he's not really one of us. But
I think there's a lot of this kind of thing that goes on, and if you think about what's likely to yield more of it, Tim, in California, Los Angeles is a Democrat city, and it's in a Democrat state. So the impetus to actually thoroughly investigate these things and really drill down, I think, is not there. And I think it's a real problem in places that have, and I'm sure, by the way, there's plenty of places that are deep red Republican that have these issues as well. And all the more reason, Tim, why single party control of a place is no bueno.
Well, lest you think that all the developments regarding liberty are negative or gloomy, we turn to Alaska and a court banning the search of gun cases during traffic stops. This is a victory for liberty, no doubt.
Tim, if this was a state court decision, so it doesn't have national precedence. However, other courts can and often do look to how state courts go through the reasoning for their decisions. If you're a judge, why do the heavy lifting, right? If some judge in Alaska already did a good job for you, you go play golf, right? So So it may have impact down the line. And I think it's very important, Tim, because firearm owners, as firearm ownership and carrying of firearms increases in this country in popularity as it has, firearm owners are harassed on an ongoing basis in this country by anti-police departments and anti-police cops who basically, if they're told that there's a gun in the car or a gun on a person, then basically use that as a cause to sort of hold that person up or molest them for another X number of minutes on the basis of the gun. And what the court said here, Tim, is gun carrying is a legal and common activity. And absent some other reason to secure the weapon or to inspect it or something else, you can't do so. And in fact, what we had here was a guy who was carrying a gun in a case, and the police officer looked inside the case, and the court said, if you want to look inside that case, you need a search warrant. And I think that's the appropriate decision, and one, if it was carried forth in all 50 states, would be a massive, massive gain in the rights to not be harassed by the police of all gun owners. But in any case, it is for Alaska right now.
Well, a small victory for liberty is a victory nonetheless. And with that, we move to, one of your home states, which you tend to renounce when appropriate and then and then proclaim as your home state when it is profitable for you. The New Jersey Supreme Court tossed...
And I disavow it in this instance. Let me say that.
Okay. That's why I set you up with that. New Jersey Supreme Court reopening thousands of DUI cases after breathalyzer miscalibrations are uncovered.
If I twist my gaze from Independence Mall, Tim, I can actually see the lovely state of New Jersey.
Well, you sound like Sarah Palin saying she can see see Russia from Alaska.
Yes, well, in many ways they are akin. And in this way as well, we've talked, I think, before, Tim, on the program about the DUI exception to the Bill of Rights. Sadly, in this country, so many states have done so much to make it easy for the states to convict people for DUIs because of the cash cow that it is. In New Jersey, for instance, there was this breathalyzer, and it required some fairly sophisticated methods in order to accurize it, and verify it. And it was just beyond the officer who was in charge of it, so he just falsified it. And now we're looking at, Tim, over 20,000 cases of drunk driving convictions that are susceptible to being overturned because of this decision. And as a matter of fact, if you think of each conviction, that could be roughly $10,000 to $15,000 all in terms of, the lawyers and the penalties and potential jail and everything else. It is a massive, massive imposition and an illegal imposition on the civil rights of New Jerseyans and those traveling through. So it's good that they found this out and that they're going to get through it all. But the better thing would have been to start with sound science in the first place rather than this voodoo black boxes that drivers in New Jersey and so many other places are subject to for DUIs.
Do we have any evidence that any individual breathalyzer tests were in fact inaccurate? That in fact they were not the people were not legally drunk but were ruled so, or is this just a systemic failure that has to just toss out all the results?
Well, all of the results from this machine, because what happens is if it's not calibrated correctly, there's no way to tell. That's the point of it, is it has to be calibrated correctly. It's not a blunt object. It's a finely tuned instrument, and it has to be treated as such if you're going to use it to steal people's liberty and their money.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Tim.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcast, The Uprising, hosted by Scott and me and Lisa K. Donner, are available to you on demand at LibertyNation.com. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We are growing exponentially on YouTube. So this is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.